Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have historian Bradley J. Sommer. He goes by Brad, so we can call him Brad Sommer. Brad is a native of Ohio. He recently graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a degree in history. We're going to talk about that. He is a historian of post-industrial cities and de-industrial cities in the Midwest with a focus on Toledo, a city I have not been to. I don't know much about Ohio, really. So we talk about the history bit, its demographics. It is a traditionally purple state and is a good bellwether for the presidential elections. It usually picks who wins the presidential election, although thankfully that did not prove true in 2020. The state went quite decisively for Trump, who I think beat Biden by 7 or 8 points. But Trump obviously did not win the election, although he still thinks he did and acted like he did in a murderous and traitorous way. But that is another topic. So Ohio seems to be kind of going in a red, almost Confederate direction at times in terms of gun laws and other things. And there's some cities in this country that are not Southern that I always have kind of thought of that way. And Cincinnati is one of them. But it is a mostly blue city usually, and the state is very reflective of others in that you have big cities that go Democrat and the neighboring counties go Republican. So even though it is a unique state and one of the bigger ones in the country in terms of population, there are a lot of similarities between it and places like Virginia or even New England or wherever you're from, really. We're seeing a big divide between not only north and south, east and west, but also city and country, which, may be an oversimplification. I'm not sure what that comes down to. I guess just education and outlook, but also racial views and xenophobia and other things. So it's a big topic, and talking about Ohio's transition after World War II to a real booming economy with industry. And once you get into the 1970s and 80s, you have the white flight from the cities and industry leaves or is downsized, and you have a lot of problems. But a lot of cities like Toledo have tried to stick it out. So we're going to talk about his dissertation and his research, also the job search, which, Brad has been hitting really hard. I enjoy reading his tweets on Twitter. He's a very funny and, sometimes kind of caustic commentator on things, but I like that. And so he's obviously very engaged with what is going on in the world politically, but also sees it through the filter of a historian. So I have been a big fan of his tweets, and he does have a good following, but he is still looking for work. He's been on the market for over a year. And so if you want a bright and engaged historian on your staff, you should definitely get in touch with Brad, who has a website. It is Bradley J. Sommer. That is SOMMER, BradleyJSummer.com. You can read more about him and look at his CV and all that good stuff. So check that out. So I am very sympathetic toward Brad and his search for work. I am doing that as well. I'm technically unemployed right now, just finished my last day at Stratford Hall. So I'm looking for work and am really more interested in doing something in publishing at this point. I think I should have tried to do that many years ago, probably when I was in grad school, get involved with the publishing trade at a press, university, or otherwise. But did not do that. I tried to teach and didn't like it, and have been trying to be an archivist, and that does not seem to be working out. I think I've passed the point of diminished returns with my career as an archivist. So fuck it. I am going to do something else and looking into publishing jobs. So I am thinking about moving in a different direction in my career. So if you're interested in what I have been doing and what I might do for you, you can get in touch with me. But a lot to talk about here on this podcast, so I'm not going to go on for too long. Check out Brad's website, and I hope you will enjoy my talk with Brad Sommer. My original dissertation was called Tomorrow Never Came, The Making of a Post-Industrial City, Toledo, Ohio. I forget the temporal parameters. I forget what year it was. But that was the proposal, and my advisor and my committee were all like, that sounds fine, go ahead. I did the majority of my research in the summer of 2019. Not all of it, because I just didn't have enough time and money for my summer trip. I was going to just do another trip either in the spring of 2020 or the summer of 2020 to wrap up. Like 1 week, maybe 2 weeks would have been all that was needed. So yeah. I started writing. I had the first chapter done sometime around Thanksgiving of 2019, I think. I was well on my way to being done with chapter 2 when the pandemic hit. Okay.
And then when the pandemic hit, didn't actually immediately react to the pandemic with regards to my dissertation, because even if there was a indefinite suspension on all of society's normal functions, I was like, well, I still have more than enough stuff done that I can keep writing for now. And then when I think it was like the second lockdown, like it's hard to remember the phases of COVID, but like
right, yeah,
everything shut down for like a couple of weeks or a month, especially depending on what state and what city you were in. I was living in Pittsburgh, which took the pandemic and still takes the pandemic more seriously than other places. Everything kind of reopened up for a little bit, and then everything shut down again. And that second shutdown of everything was the one where it was like, oh, this is going to be serious. I reached out to the archives that I needed to go to, and they both said they weren't going to be taking people for the foreseeable future. If there were digital things that they could send to you, or if like you had one small folder of materials, they could maybe scan a few things, but I needed a more substantive trip than that. So I had to then reconceptualize my dissertation and move everything back. And because of the way that my dissertation was structured, it was a very chronological dissertation, like a lot of dissertations are. I didn't have the material for the last 2 chapters, well, chapter and a half really, which meant that I couldn't make the argument that I was trying to make, because the argument that I was making in my dissertation and that I'm proposing in my book that I just submitted, or my proposal I just submitted, is to study the process of deindustrialization into post-industrialization. A lot of work has been done on how cities and really larger economic systems, states, countries, whatever, deindustrialized, which is what my dissertation ended up falling back on, which was fine, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. But what a lot of people are starting to do now, but not in the way that I'm doing it with my case study of Toledo, is looking at how deindustrialization was not the end of a process, but part of a longer process. Like cities in the 20th century of America have had this sort of life flow of industrialized, deindustrialized, post-industrialized. That was the original scope of my dissertation, and it's now going to be the scope of my book. I'm excited to hopefully get this contract. I'll find out in a couple of weeks, I guess, if I do. But it's a continuation of my dissertation, but it's not just here's my dissertation with a lot of the jargon and dissertation kind of prose taken out. Like it's a little bit more work on my part, but it sounds like my potential future editor doesn't really care about that, so that's good.
Okay. Are you from Toledo?
I am not. So okay. I am originally from Ohio. I'm from Canton, Ohio.
Okay.
I did my undergraduate at the University of Toledo, though.
Okay. Is that kind of where you got the idea for Toledo, or what was the thought process in terms of the city? I mean, I'm guessing you probably do. I don't know how big Canton is, but I'm guessing that's kind of a post-industrial city too.
Yeah. Well, so the second question first. That's one of the things that I argue in my book is a deindustrial city, by and large, has a lot of the same figures or has a lot of the same images and contours and sort of looks the same either in your mind or in reality. Reduced populations, empty business districts, neighborhoods in disrepair, factories and mills and stuff that have closed and are just sort of rusting away or overgrown with weeds. But post-industrial cities aren't a monolith. And post-industrialization, the process of becoming a post-industrial city is not the same everywhere. You know, a lot of people, I think, and this is sort of an inference that I've made from just the things that I've read and people that I talk to, when they think of a post-industrial city, they're starting to think more of places like Pittsburgh or Cleveland, or even like parts of Boston where there's a lot of like the med and ed and tech and finance, these new big economic sectors. And people tend to frame post-industrial cities as being cities that successfully turned the page on deindustrialization. And that's one of the things that I argue is that not every post-industrial city is a quote-unquote success story.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily still a deindustrialized city. Like, I'm not going to name any names because, you know, I don't want to offend anybody who lives in those cities, but there are plenty of cities that if you go to, you can see this is still very much a deindustrial city. There's nothing has really replaced or attempted to replace the steel industry, the auto industry, the shipping industry, whatever. But a place like Toledo and kind of a place like Canton or Akron, they have kind of replaced that dominant industry that left, but not fully. They're still kind of working it out. But you would never go to Toledo now and see all the things happening there and go, oh, this is still a deindustrial city mired in depression and discord and unrest. Like, it's still, you know, a disaster here. We need to get FEMA in here right away. Like, you would never say that about Toledo, but you would also not go, oh yeah, Toledo is the new Pittsburgh or new Cleveland. Like, Toledo has the Silicon something or other. That's, everyone just attaches Silicon to a city that has any kind of tech industry now.
I don't know really anything about Ohio, either the history or I've maybe been through a couple airports, but I've never really spent any time there. I mean, you know, in pop culture, probably, you know, Cleveland is more prominent than any other city there. So you kind of, you know, from TV and movies and stuff, but like Toledo, which I'm guessing is quite a bit bigger than Canton. Is that more sort of like a Detroit type of city where they're making cars? Like, what was sort of their claim to fame in terms of industrial?
Yeah. Well, let me give you like a 1.5 or 2 minute sort of breakdown of Ohio here really quick before I answer, because it's important for anyone listening who doesn't know about Ohio, but I also think it helps with Toledo. The biggest cities in Ohio are Columbus, then Cleveland, then Cincinnati, then Toledo, then I believe it's Dayton, then Akron, then Canton. I think that's the order.
Okay.
Columbus is far and away the biggest. Columbus, people don't realize, Ohio, I think, is like the 7th or 8th biggest city in the country. There's just under 12 million people in Ohio. Columbus has just under or just over 900,000 people in like the city proper. The metro area is like much, much bigger than that. For context, Columbus as a city, again, like the metro area and even just like the city urban area, Columbus is bigger than Boston.
Yeah.
People think of Ohio cities as being like these tiny little cities. Columbus is bigger than Boston is by a non-insignificant amount. Industrially, Ohio sort of had a couple of regions. So like Northeast Ohio, where Cleveland's at, and also where Canton is at, where Youngstown is at, where Akron is at, was mostly still actually steel. That was part of like the big steel belt of America.
Okay.
Akron being really the one exception. Akron's big claim to fame economically and kind of socially was rubber. Goodyear was headquartered. Actually, Goodyear is still headquartered in Akron. I think the R&D stuff is still done there, and they have this partnership with the University of Akron Engineering. But Goodyear made tires, and they were, I think, the biggest tire maker in the world. But everybody else in Northeast Ohio was probably in steel production or some kind of ancillary steel industry. My dad works in the steel industry still.
Okay.
Southwest Ohio, where Cincinnati's at, was a variety of things. You had a lot of shipping because of trains in the Ohio River there. Cincinnati made a lot of things, but not necessarily like one dominant industry. You know, historically, Cincinnati was one of the hog towns of the U.S. A lot of pork being processed and shipped in and out of Cincinnati. Northwest Ohio, where Toledo is at. Toledo is really like the city of Northwest Ohio. If you draw a line straight up from Columbus and straight over from Columbus, going north and going west, that whole area of Ohio is not quite as densely populated as like Northeast Ohio is. And Toledo is really the biggest city there. Toledo had two dominant industries. It did make cars. There were cars made in Toledo. There's still cars made in Toledo. Toledo, more than making cars, made car parts. There were a lot of parts manufacturing industries in Toledo. Axles, radiators, die-cast car pieces, the sort of technically specific things that it was easier for Ford, GM, Chrysler, whatever, to have somebody else make than for them to have their own production facility, making it on their site. Toledo did make some cars, but the big thing for Toledo was the glass industry. Toledo's nickname is the Glass City. Most of the glass in the country and a lot of the glass in the world was made and developed in Toledo. Everything from like drinkware. So if you go to a restaurant or a bar, lift up the glass, pint glass, there's a little curly QL. That's the Libby Owens Ford Glass Company. That's in Toledo, Ohio. Everything from that to insulated storm windows to fiberglass, Owens Corning fiberglass with the Pink Panther. That was developed and made in Toledo. So glass was really Toledo's big thing. So Toledo had a reciprocal relationship with Detroit. A lot of the cars being made in Detroit were being fitted with glass made by Toledo companies, or were being fitted with specific parts made by Toledo companies. But it wasn't exactly a little version of Detroit, though.
Okay, so you're actually closer to Detroit in Toledo than you would be to, say, Cleveland?
Yeah, you're about 45 minutes from Detroit. Maybe a little bit more if the traffic is bad going up, 75?
Okay.
But if you get on 75 in Toledo is bisected by Interstate 80 going east and west and Interstate 75 going north and south. If you get on 75 and go up, all of the signs are saying to Detroit. So it's pretty close. Cleveland is, I've actually never made the drive just straight from Detroit to Cleveland. Toledo is definitely closer to Detroit, both physically, but also kind of culturally. Like if you go to Toledo, there's somewhat famously a store that sells perfectly half and half Ohio State and Michigan apparel.
Yeah.
Toledo is the only place in Ohio where you're just as likely to find a Michigan fan as an Ohio State fan, or really a fan of any other team. You might find some people who are like West Virginia fans or Pitt fans in southeastern Ohio, but Toledo is almost truly half and half.
I passed a sign for. I was just down in the Carolinas and I passed something. It was like a store that says, equally divided or whatever it was. I can't remember which teams those. I'm assuming it was probably like Duke and Chapel Hill, but something along those lines for football fans. But is Ohio kind of one of those classic states where there's like a north-south divide politically, where the southern part's more conservative, the northern part is more progressive, or is it just kind of a mixed bag? Because Cincinnati technically is southern, right? I mean, it's below the Mason-Dixon line, isn't it? Cincy?
Ohio has a weird geography.
Yeah.
It's not like Illinois, where there's one city that just like dominates the population, and then consequently the politics, the culture, the economics of the state. Like, Chicago really dominates Illinois.
Right.
In a way that like Columbus does not. Like Columbus is the second biggest city in the Midwest, but like it's not nearly as dominant population wise as Chicago is in Illinois.
Right.
So like Ohio, if you look at a map of Ohio, you have Cleveland up in Northeast Ohio, Columbus fairly central in Ohio, a little offset to the southwest, but mostly in the center. Cincinnati in the far southwest. And you can almost draw a line from Cincinnati to Cleveland going through Columbus. And there actually is a line. It's called Interstate 71. Interstate 71 bisects all three of those states, going in like a kind of bowed but almost perfect line across the state.
Yeah.
And then you have Toledo up in the northwest. You have Dayton sort of more or less west of Columbus and straight north of Cincinnati. You can go from Cincinnati to Dayton to Toledo just by going up Interstate 75. Akron and Canton are in northeast Ohio, just south of Cleveland. And then southeastern Ohioans are going to get mad at me when I say this, but I don't really care because there's not that many people there. There's not that many people there.
Right.
Southeastern Ohio does not have a major city. Probably the most important city in southeastern Ohio is either Marietta, which is right on the border to West Virginia, or maybe Athens, Ohio, where the University of Ohio, or where Ohio University is. With the way that the cities are kind of staggered across the state, if you look at like an electoral map of Ohio, let's say Cleveland is just this huge blue island. Akron, pretty blue. Canton is in Stark County, which is like the classic purple county. There's a lot of purple counties in northeast Ohio. You have some blue along the lake. Toledo's a big blue spot. Columbus is a huge blue spot. Cincinnati is mostly blue, although you get to pretty conservative country if you go about 10 minutes outside of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And then the population of Ohio is very weird. You have these big urban centers not close to each other really at all, with the exception of Akron and Canton being like almost on top of each other. And then you have tons and tons of like medium-sized cities and towns across the state that sort of balance it out. So like where a big city like Chicago can sort of dominate the state, Ohio, even with 4 decent-sized cities that are pretty consistently liberal, it doesn't really balance out all of those other smaller towns across the state. So
right.
It's a weird state in terms of how the population is distributed politically. The real problem in Ohio, which this isn't the question you asked, but I'll bring it up, is gerrymandering. Ohio is one of the more gerrymandered states in the country. Jim Jordan, who I am not a huge fan of. I don't know that anyone's really. I mean, I'm sure his mother loves him, but
right.
His district, if you look at it, is this just backwards, like child's first drawing zigzagging line, like a kid who doesn't know how to color with their fingers yet and just grabs the crayon with their whole hand and scribbles. That's what his district looks like. And like it takes parts of this place and parts of this place and parts of this place that are more liberal and then just subsumes them into this huge, very conservative area of northwest and north central Ohio that's really rural. And you look at it and you're like, there are people who are like 400 miles away from each other in the same district. That makes absolutely no sense in a state that is population-wise big, but area-wise, Ohio is not a huge state. Like, there's the Ohio's districts are intentionally designed, and the Ohio Supreme Court has actually recently ruled that the Ohio Republican-controlled House can't, they need to make a change to the map because it's clearly biased. I don't know if it's gerrymandered to the point where Ohio would be like this firmly blue state forever, but when people criticize Ohio's politics, they're not wrong to criticize our politics. We got some interesting characters here, to be extremely polite about it. But the same state that voted for Rob Portman and is going to have to choose between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance is also the same state that gave us Sherrod Brown, who is like one of the more progressive, popular, leftist senators, leftist congresspeople in the entire country. You know what I mean? So like that's kind of a good encapsulation of Ohio. Ohio gave us Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown at the same time.
Well, I think what you're talking about too, I mean, I know every state is kind of got specifics and idiosyncrasies and everything, but like what you're talking about, you basically describe a lot of states, and it's not, I mean, the geography is different obviously here in Virginia, but the same sort of trends. You have blue cities, and then everything between the cities is, Alabama, essentially. I mean, it gets very conservative very quickly. And I mean, I'm from the Northeast. So even in Massachusetts, like where I'm from, I mean, it was like shocking to me last few times I was there, like how Trumpy, MAGA-ish with the flags and signs and everything it had become. And, it's a reliably blue state. Even a Republican governor in Massachusetts is going to be fairly progressive. It's nothing like, other parts of the country, but yeah, I mean, things have been gerrymandered, in Virginia because of Northern Virginia and the East Coast. That's kind of your solid blue areas, Richmond, mostly blue, But yeah, it doesn't mean they're not going to get outvoted by all these counties that are blood red. I mean, it's just sort of the way things are going.
This is a really good example of Ohio. Like, not to overinflate the importance of my hometown, but like Stark County is one of those counties that they watch on election night, because with like two exceptions, Stark County has mostly gone the way of the general election since like Jimmy Carter. Like, Ohio voted for Trump, or Stark County voted for Trump 2020, not for Biden. And then I'm pretty sure that Stark County voted for Gore over Bush by like a smallish margin. But like Stark County is a classic purple county, and they always look at it on election night. And my parents' house, my parents are still there. If you go down the street, there's a house that I distinctly remember having a hope sign, the classic Obama hope sign. Those people now have like 3 MAGA flags. They have an upside down American flag up their flagpole, a Blue Lives Matter flag. They have some kind of, I can't remember what it is, but some kind of sign that more or less iterates that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. Really, really rational, reasonable people that live down the street from my parents.
Yeah.
But like 7-8 years ago, those people were solidly voting for Obama. And now Obama is the Antichrist and Trump is Jesus. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's really crazy because I lived briefly in it was a coastal county here in Virginia. It's a small town, but I was looking at the voting in like 2016. The county went for Obama, but then or Obama twice actually in 2008 and 2012. But in 2016, it went like 2 out of 3 for Trump. Mm-hmm. So something happened there. I mean, obviously it's a complicated issue, and like what you've researched and written about, post industry or deindustrialization. Like, I can't always account, like you said, like it's just sort of an irrational phenomenon to a certain degree. Maybe I don't know if it's Fox News, it's like constant propaganda mill. People have changed their minds, or they're just so angry and desperate they just turn on whoever's in power. Because I mean, we both lived through the Bush years. The same deal. Guy gets elected twice, and then by 2008, people can't stand him. They want Republicans out. So I don't know if it's just this kind of whiplash we're seeing. I mean, Trump lost big in 2020. I mean, I know he doesn't admit it, and the Electoral College wasn't necessarily a complete blowout, but I mean, 7 million votes, that's a lot. And so I don't know what exactly is happening. Sometimes it's hard to gauge, obviously. Maybe like with Ohio, like, because where I grew up, it's like every town had a factory, even if it was like 4,000 or 5,000 people. Is Ohio kind of like that? Like, obviously you got the big cities, but like even these smaller towns, is there some kind of mill pretty much everywhere?
A lot of the smaller towns in Ohio do have that place. I mean, you also have a lot of agriculture in Ohio.
Yeah.
No matter what part of the state you're in, so there's a lot of agriculture. But yeah, I mean, if you go to any town in Ohio, like you'll find something. I mean, if you go to Worcester, Ohio, which is not spelled the same as the Worcester in your neck of the woods, we spell it phonetically. You spell it whatever you want to call that. Ours is Wooster.
Okay.
But in Worcester, Ohio, there was the Rubbermaid factory where Rubbermaid containers were made, those big locking containers that you can store stuff in.
Yeah.
And they were like far and away the dominant employer in that area. Like there's a very nice liberal arts college there that has been there for a long time, but Rubbermaid was the big entity, and they only moved their production in the last like 15 years or so. Like it's been fairly recently, but like when that happened, it was kind of devastating for the city. And as of right now, they haven't really replaced that with anything because they didn't really think they were going to.
Yeah.
But I mean, you go to, the smaller towns in Southeast Ohio, or the small towns that kind of dot the landscape between the bigger cities. And yeah, like, there's a former coal mine that closed. There's a natural gas place that closed. There's a smaller ancillary steel mill that maybe just refined raw iron and shipped it somewhere else or something like that. Like a lot of these places had a place like that was, essential to the town's social and economic identity.
And a place like Toledo, I mean, was its heyday maybe like the 50s and 60s? How has it sort of dealt with the changes? Is it coming back, or has it come back, or is it one of those sort of poster child cities like Detroit, which I think it's trying to make its way back, but it's got a lot of problems. Like, kind of where's Toledo on the spectrum, if you want to call it that?
Toledo and Detroit are hard to compare in terms of their post-industrial path and their situations right now, because a lot of people won't admit this, but the big problem that Detroit has had is that the city has been largely abandoned by the United States government. I mean, you can really say that about most of Michigan. Detroit, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think there's a lot of historical research and contemporary research that sort of bears this out. Detroit became too black, and the U.S. government, with its its less than positive history of racial equality, decided to just let Detroit go. I mean, there's really no reason for things to be as bad in Detroit as they are. Now, things were probably always going to be bad because the auto industry did leave, but there's no reason that, like, people don't really, I think, appreciate how big Detroit was. At one point, I think Detroit was the 5th biggest city in the United States. It was a huge city. And it physically, it still is. Like, if you've ever had the opportunity to drive into Detroit, I highly recommend it, because Detroit is a gorgeous city. Beautiful skyline. It looks like what you want a city to look like. But when you're driving into Detroit, going up Interstate 75, about 20 minutes outside of the city, you just see this like ocean of rail yards and production facilities, a lot of which are still there. They're not probably in use, but you get a sense of scale of how big the city was. Any other city in the United States that was that size would have been, to use a modern expression, too big to fail. If a comparable city of that size and economic importance was just on the brink of collapse, the federal government would have intervened in some capacity. They would have given loans. They would have reconsolidated and restructured loans. Like, they would have done something. A large reason why Detroit has failed so badly is not because of anything the people of Detroit has done. It's because people didn't want to save Detroit. And I think a large part of that is that Detroit is a very heavily African-American city. And I think a lot of people just didn't want to help because they just didn't want to help.
Yeah.
Toledo is not quite like that. Toledo's heyday was in the 50s and 60s. And this is one of the things I argue in my book. Toledo's heyday was never like the heyday of other cities, where like they were these massive industrial and economic powerhouses that were like on the map, so to speak. My book kind of argues that like Toledo did have a moment where they were fairly prominent in the industrial manufacturing economy of the U.S., but Toledo was constantly, and when I say Toledo in this case, I mean like the social, political, and economic elites of Toledo. The labor leaders, business leaders, the government, major social figures in the city. They were always constantly trying to build Toledo into the great city of tomorrow rather than the city of today. My book is called Tomorrow Never Came. The title comes from an exhibit called Toledo Tomorrow that was built in 1945 by the same architect that did the Futurama exhibit.
Okay.
And Toledo Tomorrow was this large model, of the city, and Toledo was going to be the next great American city, and it was going to be the model for all other great American cities. It was going to have this like 4-in-1 intermodal transport hub. It was going to have this like, in a lot of ways, it was a very attractive model. Urban planners look at some of the things now and probably go, "Oh, that's interesting." They didn't have highways that were just like crisscrossing the city and demolishing neighborhoods, which you see in the 70s and 80s when a lot of predominantly immigrant and a lot of African-American communities are demolished to make room for highway overpasses and stuff. Toledo Tomorrow was this really, really interesting model of what a city could look like. And it obviously never happened. But throughout the post-war decades, even all the way up into like the 80s and 90s, you still have remnants of that idea. Like, rather than focus on the issues right now and fixing them right now, a lot of the people with the power to make change in Toledo were focused on making Toledo great in 25 years. And that's one of the things that I think separates Toledo from other cities, is that Toledo never had this, like, quote unquote heyday, but had a moment where it could have developed a heyday, if that makes sense. Because of the people in charge making the decisions they made or didn't make, it didn't really happen.
But also maybe didn't fall quite as far as some cities. I mean, again, Detroit is kind of like the obvious example everyone kind of points to. I'm guessing maybe didn't bottom out the way Detroit did, or I don't know, how bad did things get?
It's hard to make that comparison, although you're probably leaning towards that, and I think you probably could say that it never really, quote unquote, bottomed out the way that Detroit did. Toledo is kind of in I don't want to say a liminal spot, because that immediately outs me as a historian, although I guess everybody knows that now. But Toledo is in sort of a liminal spot, this sort of transitory moment where it is sort of re-identifying itself, but it's not finished yet.
Yeah.
Like Toledo, and again, part of it is, it's kind of reductionist, but part of it is an issue of scale too. Like, it's a little bit easier for a city, Toledo's population right now is, I think it's like 130,000, 170,000, somewhere in there. I should know this off the top of my head. It's very unprofessional. I don't. Toledo's population right now is 270,000. That's it, not 170.
Okay, mid-sized city.
It's a classic mid-sized city.
Yeah.
Toledo's population at the biggest was like 350 or something like that. Like, Toledo's population has definitely been reduced, but I mean, some of these former industrial cities, their populations have dropped by like half.
Yeah.
Like Pittsburgh is actually a great example. Pittsburgh's population almost got cut in half from the 1960s, 70s to, the 1990s. Like, Toledo's population never really did that. So, like, you still have enough people and enough infrastructure in place in Toledo that things can move in, or really, in the case of Toledo, not necessarily move in, but sort of ascend from within and kind of take that place. But yeah, there's a scalular difference between Toledo and Detroit, or even Toledo and places like East St. Louis or Gary, Indiana, that make it, not exactly a one-to-one comparison.
And I think some of these mid-sized cities maybe have a little bit more of an advantage in some ways, because they're not so big that the fallout is going to be enormous. It's like a star that like expands and then explodes in on itself. It's like, that's kind of what happened in Detroit, kind of what happened in Baltimore. Like, it was over 1 million people at one point in Baltimore or thereabouts. It was a really big city, and it's contracted down to maybe, half that or so now. So it's like, those cities, when the fallout happens, it's really palpable. Whereas like some of these mid-sized cities, Richmond is an example of that. We've seen a demographic increase, a demographic shift. Used to be predominantly African American, now it's about 50-50. But it never totally bottomed out. I mean, maybe got down to like 190,000 people or whatever from like 250 at its peak. It's never been a huge city. So in some ways, it's kind of got this density that has kept it alive, kept it going. And the industry was a different industry story. We're comparing very different parts of the country, but like Philip Morris didn't leave. So the industrial jobs were kind of here. The service industry jobs, could come back fairly easily. Didn't have that huge industrial base the way other cities did. So it's kind of benefit from that in a way. People moving downtown. It's not a huge city geographically either. So it does have some advantages, as bad as things got. And I think around the time that I was an undergrad, because I was going to college in like the mid 90s, started in 93 college, like that was sort of the tail end of the really bad crime, drug issues with certain cities. So even mid-sized cities were having huge problems, and that kind of started to, it started to get better around 94, 95, and New York City, again, perfect example of that. So like, kind of see that coming back. But Detroit, it's like, again, like people just keep referring to it, and I know it has enormous problems, but like maybe the contraction in Detroit is sort of bottomed. You know what I mean? Like, you can only lose so many people, I think. I mean, I know a lot of people have left in a lot of industry, but still Ford, I mean, they're still making cars. And I think just recently, Amazon overtook Ford or something like that. Like Ford is still a very wealthy, productive company, and the auto industry is still huge. So it's not like everything left and there's no job. I mean, obviously not. But maybe it does need to just contract, or maybe it's finished that process and it's kind of gonna go up maybe a bit, and then maybe it'll plane out at like 650, 700,000 people. I don't know. But yeah, when you look at the stats, like you go back just on like Wikipedia, I like to check out like, well, when things start going wrong, and you just look at the census around 1970, you maybe see a plateau, and then
Toledo peaked population wise in this in the 70s at like 380,000, I think, something like that.
It's crazy to think how big some of these cities were. Yeah, I mean,
I think that's one of the things. Like I made that point about Columbus now and Cleveland. Cleveland is another good example. I was talking about Detroit. Cleveland at one point had almost 1 million people in it.
Yeah,
like Cleveland was one of the 10 biggest cities in the United States, and its population is significantly reduced.
Yeah.
Toledo's population never was that big, but it's shrunk pretty dramatically. I mean, even since I moved away from Toledo to go to grad school, I think the city's lost like 15,000 people. But then if you look now, it's hard to know exactly, because it's not like everyone who moves when they move makes a note in the census of where they're moving to. But there are like 3 or 4 like small cities or like incorporated borough kind of towns around Toledo: Perrysburg, Maumee, Sylvania. Their populations have actually all gone up. So I suspect some of the population shift from Toledo has been to those places. Like Sylvania is like literally you're in Toledo, boom, now you're in Sylvania.
Yeah.
Perrysburg is like 20 minutes away if you hop on the interstate. And, there are people who live in Perrysburg and work in Toledo. Maumee is kind of the same. Like on one side of Interstate 80 is Maumee, and on the other side is Toledo.
It's not like the states themselves are really losing people. I mean, just about every census, states are gaining more. It's just a matter of who's gaining the most for representation and stuff. But yeah, I mean, people move to the counties. So the metropolitan area has increased, even if the quote unquote city part has gone down, because, everyone will just drive or whatever. So yeah, I mean, like around here, Richmond too, it's like the counties have more people than the actual city, but collectively, I don't know, 1 million people in the Richmond area. So, but that changes things politically, obviously. And I'm sure in your research too, like the Toledo suburbs are more conservative than the city, right?
Yeah, I mean, more conservative in a sense. It's not like you get to, Maumee or Perrysburg and you're in, hardcore Republican country.
Right.
But there's definitely some white flight going on, so to speak, in a lot of the suburban growth in and around Toledo.
And the weird thing here in Virginia is that cities are cities. They're not in a county per se. So like Richmond's just its own thing. But Ohio, I'm guessing the cities are part of a larger county, correct?
Yeah, Ohio, that's another thing about Ohio that I think some people don't know is Ohio, for a city its size, has a lot of counties. There's 88 counties in Ohio.
Right.
A lot of that is because Ohio was the principal state of the Western Territory. And so a lot of those counties, like if you drive around the small towns of Ohio and you're in some of these, less populated counties, you'll see markers, like historic markers, or even signs on like the county courthouse or whatever. Some of these places are extremely old, which is why there are so many counties. But like, if you look at, the cities of Ohio, they are mostly within a single county. Like Canton is fully inside Stark County.
Yeah.
But like, Toledo is almost entirely in Lucas County. Like parts of the city of Toledo do spread into other counties, but it's not like Philadelphia or something. Philadelphia is in like 5 counties. Like you can reasonably say that you're living in Philadelphia if you're living in like Philadelphia or in like, Delaware County or whatever.
That's weird. I didn't know that. Because usually they want to keep it in one county.
Well, because Philadelphia also is such a bigger city. You know what I mean? Like it'd be hard for Philadelphia unless it turned into like a megapolis city like New York or Chicago to be entirely in one county.
Yeah, that's true.
Cleveland is mostly in Cuyahoga County, kind of parts of it in Sandusky, but Ohio cities are largely concentrated in one county with maybe a little bit of spillover.
Okay. Because where I grew up, I mean, there weren't in Massachusetts, there aren't a lot of counties, and the one I was in was, I think, one of the biggest ones. So I didn't really think about these counties. When you go to the South, like you said, or the Midwest, you have 88 counties in Ohio, and here in Virginia, there's just like 75 or whatever. Yeah, there's a ton of them, and people kind of identify more from their counties here because they are separate from the cities. And I think politically, it's there's a political reason for that, and I think the cities wanted self-government, so they're not susceptible to whatever the county is doing or thinking. So it kind of makes sense, but it also seems a little weird here in Virginia the way it's set up. I think it would probably be beneficial if the counties and the cities were sharing the same political geography, but whatever. I'm sure they're not going to change it, so it's just going to deal with it. But,
no, I mean, it makes for really challenging and interesting moments. Like in Ohio, a lot of the counties too are also broken up by townships.
Okay.
So I grew up technically in Canton, Ohio. The school that I went to was technically in Massillon, which is a city not too terribly far away. To be honest, they should just incorporate into one big city, but I'm sure that'll piss off a lot of people in Massillon, but they'll get over it. But like in the winter, and the roads are really bad because this is the Midwest. This is the winters are brutal here. There are like different responsibilities for like different parts of like snow clearance. So like, is it the state? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it the township? There's bureaucratically, it's kind of nuts around here. Who's in charge of what? Like, I lived in Canton most of my life. I'm here right now while I'm looking for work. And like, there are still things where I don't actually know who's in charge of that. Is it the township, the county, the city? Like, I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Like there's a township board of trustees. I have no idea what they do other than like probably the school board stuff. There's a county board of trustees or county something or other. No idea what they're in charge of. Like, it's very weird. It's kind of infuriating. I would rather just have like everyone agree to pool their resources to the city and then have, some kind of equal administrative entity that runs the city to make sure that all parts of the area are attended to. But no, it's kind of a mess.
Yeah, for sure. All right, you went to Carnegie Mellon. Let's maybe talk about that, talk about your time there and who you worked with. Was your advisor pretty hands-on, or was he more?
Yeah, this is a good transition into some other stuff. Like, I can talk about Toledo and the Midwest and industry and all day, but I'm sure not everyone wants to hear that all day. So my education experience is a little bit different. So like, I went to Toledo for my undergrad. I had maybe a couple of big classes as a first year student, but most of my classes were small because Toledo, it's not a small school, but it's not a huge school. It's a good sized school. I have very few bad things to say about the University of Toledo. Go Rockets. But I was also in the honors college. I transferred into the honors college after my first semester or so. And those classes were really small. I mean, it was almost kind of like being in grad school. Like a typical honors college class was maybe like 10, 15 people. And then I took a lot of upper level history courses early on, and those were pretty small. So, I mean, I had smaller classes, and then that's actually where I came across my Toledo project. I had to do a senior honors thesis and ended up doing it on the Autolite strike. And that spiraled into this huge, 50-year project that I'm doing. And then I went to the University of Cincinnati for my master's. I think the biggest class that I had to TA for there was like 150 students, but it was broken into like 6 sections. So, each of us TAs had 2 sections. So, I mean, again, not huge classes. And then, and our grad program at Cincinnati was probably like 25 people, because I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know Cincinnati had a master's and Ph.D. program, like a terminal master's program and a Ph.D. program. So we had a lot of master's students, and then maybe like at the time that I was there, like 5, 6 PhD students. You know, we mostly master's students.
You got
and then
two
I went
masters.
So what?
Yeah, you got two masters. They're like totally separate things. Like
it's a quirk of, so I went to Carnegie Mellon for my PhD, and at the end of your coursework part of your program, of the program at CMU, you get a master's degree.
Okay.
I don't know why. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I don't know why they don't just have a master's program and a PhD program, if that's the route that they want to take.
I talked to someone.
I technically have a second master's in history.
Okay.
I have 2 master's degrees in the exact same thing. It's pretty unnecessary.
Okay. I thought it was something like that because I just talked to someone who had a master's in history and he had what is it called, like a master's of philosophy or whatever. And I was like, what is that? He's like, well, if it's basically like you said, you do your coursework, you're not ABD, so it's kind of like another stepping stone, I guess, so that maybe if you don't finish your PhD, you still have the master's degree from the program. But he didn't do like separate coursework or anything.
I think that's why we have the master's built into the PhD program at CMU, so that if you dropped out, you could like, hey, you know, you're because almost, not even almost, everybody who's a full-time PhD student at CMU, at least when I was there, had full funding. We didn't accept people if we weren't going to fund them, which it diminishes the size of the program, but I also think it's a responsible way to do business. Like, you know, I cannot stand these programs that admit people and then, you know, 20% of the people who get in get funding. The other 80% have to duke it out, you know, blood game style to see who gets funding in year 3 after accruing $200,000 in debt. You know who you are, schools that do that. Everyone thinks you're terrible. That's a terrible moral and ethical thing to do, and you should be ashamed of yourself.
I mean, that was my situation. I went in with I was an idiot. Like,
no, I will no. See, here's the thing. I will never blame the students for doing that. I will never criticize somebody for getting an education of any kind.
Yeah.
People who want to go on Twitter and like yell at people who are announcing, I just got accepted to the PhD program at whatever university, and these people who swoop in and are like, congratulations on ruining your life. You know, that's a terrible decision. Yeah. Academia is awful. It's like, yeah, academia is a mess. And I hope that person who just got into that PhD program knows what they're getting into in terms of what academia is like, what the job market's like. But I don't know how much cursing you allow on your podcast, but how fucking dare anybody criticize somebody for getting an education, especially if you're a first-gen student or if you're from like a marginalized background. Like, that might be the biggest deal in their life or in their family's life. Like, I know so many people who are like that. Like, my mom went to college, but my sister and I are the first people to get advanced degrees. You know what I mean? Like, it was a big deal when my sister and I both got our doctorates. Like, a huge deal. It was a big thing. And again, the people in our family had gone to college before. You know, only a few people, but I can't wrap my head around the people who just criticize the idea of somebody going to grad school. I see infinite value in education just for the sake of getting education. I think that's a wonderful thing. And again, I cannot get around the sort of elitist idea of people with advanced degrees, usually in positions of like kind of power. Like, I've seen tenured professors comment about students, you know, should drop out of programs. They shouldn't go to grad school. It's like, well, that's easy for you to say. You went to Harvard and now you're a tenured professor somewhere. Like, have a little bit of sense of who you are when you make that comment. Like, I can't get on it. And again, I just say, how dare somebody make that point? But I'll never criticize students for going to grad school, especially if they know what they're getting into.
I hope
sometimes they don't know, but yeah, that's a different thing.
And I really didn't. And maybe it was a different time to the extent of like people racking up debt and, you know, the job market, because the job market for teaching is really bad right now. And you've dealt with that daily. So,
well, the job market for teaching is great if you're willing to be an adjunct for the rest of your life.
Well, sure.
And make a poverty wage.
Yeah. No, there's no shortage of adjunct jobs to a certain degree. Cause like, you can just approach a department head and be like, hey, can I teach a class? They'll be like, yeah, sure. Enjoy your $3,000 or whatever, for the whole semester. But it's like tenure track. I mean, people have always been talking about how hard it is to get tenure track jobs. So even before I was in grad school back in the late 90s, like people were talking about how bad it is and how bad it was in the 70s and stuff. But like, I mean, it seems harder than any time I mean, absolutely it's harder than any time I remember. And when I was on the market, 2005, it was amazing compared to what's going on now. So it was pre-Great Recession, Silicon Valley's booming, it's like things looked really good until 2008. But I don't know, like, one reason I wanted to talk to you is to kind of get a sense of the grad school experience now, because I feel like my department was kind of old school, not necessarily overtly conservative politically, but just sort of how they did things. The methodology there was pretty conservative. You do paper research, you write a dissertation, and then you get a job. Like there's no emphasis on teaching necessarily. So I don't know, like in your cohort, like did you have people who were kind of with you all the way through that you were close with, you had friends, like you had some fun when you were ABD, or I don't know, like maybe it's hard to compare because it's the only experience you've had, but like,
right.
Kind of what was your experience as a grad student, I guess is what I'm saying.
So I can give you my experience, but I can also say, I'm familiar with the experience of a lot of people. I was the vice president and then the president of the largest graduate and professional student organization in the country while I was in grad school, the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students, NAGPS. At one point, I think as president, I was the representative of like 500,000 grad and professional students across the country. So I've heard a lot of experiences, and I know that my experience is different, but also similar. For history, I think mine is pretty similar. So I started my PhD program in 2015. I just graduated last year. My advisor, I'll get off the bat, was Joe Trotter, Joe William Trotter Jr., as he's known professionally. Quite possibly the nicest person I have ever met in academia, almost unnecessarily so. Like it's sort of not off-putting, but it's sort of shocking when you meet Joe, how good and decent of a person he is. Cause like Joe could easily be an asshole if he wanted to. He's famous. He's like, in America, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Like he's written tons of books. He's a famous historian, especially in the fields of urban history, labor history, African American history. Like the man's a legend. So he has every right, if he wanted to be a mean-spirited dick. He is not. He is the nicest, most helpful person. He's the reason I went to Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon has a nice history program. I love the city of Pittsburgh. It's my favorite city in the U.S. But I went to work with Joe. And so when I got accepted, I was elated because that meant that Joe liked me. And I was like, oh my gosh, Joe likes me. Joe was a fantastic advisor. He was the perfect advisor for me and really for anybody, because I've talked to other students of Joe, and the impression that I get is Joe is whatever kind of advisor you needed him to be. If you needed that constant, like monthly check-in of like, hey, how are classes going? Hey, how's your prospectus going? Are you doing well on your reading list? How's the research going? He would do that. I don't need that. I am very intrinsically motivated. I am very good at getting work done on my own, setting my own schedules. And so once the coursework was done, I would talk with Joe. I didn't make decisions unilaterally. He approved of everything, but he never disapproved of any proposal that I made in terms of like timeline. So like when I did my exam list, which I'll backtrack and explain how the program worked there. When I did my exam list, I told him, how about every month I just tell you what I've read, just so that you get a sense of the progress I'm making. And then when I finish the list, we can chat. He's like, all right, sounds good. Okay. When I was writing and researching, I told him, because I did this huge outline of my dissertation before I wrote it. The outline had all of my research put into it in chronological order. I even had done the footnotes because I figured while I was looking at the materials and I could see the notations there, I might as well do the notations now. So every document that I had was in this timeline document. And so when I showed it to Joe, he was like, wow, you seemed really prepared to write this. And I was like, I am really prepared. So when it came to actually writing the dissertation, I was like, how about I just every 2 months a chapter? He's like, that works. That'll get you done 3 months before you graduate or even earlier. So sounds great. And so I would just send him a chapter whenever it was done, and then he would get it back to me. It was great. It was perfect. He was the perfect advisor for what I needed. And then again, it also helps that he's just a really kind and decent person in general. You know, when my grandfather passed away, without even having to ask, Joe was like, we're going to put all of your stuff on hold for right now. I don't want to hear from you unless you need it. I don't want to see you unless you need to see me. Like, go be with your family for a while. School can wait. When I came out in 2018, same deal. He's like, if you need to take some time and deal with personal stuff, that's fine. We can always make your schedule work for you. I have zero complaints about my experience with Joe Trotter. If you're fortunate enough to meet him, you'll probably have the same experience.
That's nice. That's nice to hear, because everyone is not that lucky.
No, I know. Like I'm extraordinarily lucky.
Yeah.
When I hear, especially with people in the sciences who are much more beholden to their advisors because that's where their funding is coming from. Some of the horror stories that I've heard about, like misfeasance, let alone malfeasance, like not even getting into advisors that are emotionally abusive or sexually inappropriate or sexually abusive, like that's far too rampant in academia, and that's a problem. But even just advisors that like don't ever interact with you. Like a professor of mine, I won't say who, and I won't say who his professor was, but his advisor was and is one of the biggest professors in that field. Like my professor was he. I won't even give you any identifying information for his advisor, but his advisor was this incredibly famous person, and like he never really talked to them the entire time he was there. Like he sent them his dissertation, and that was the first time that they had interacted since like his first year in the program as like a first year PhD student.
Yeah.
That I think is even bad on its own, because if you're not able and willing to make the time to be around and with your advisees, you shouldn't be an advisor. Like there needs to be some kind of there needs to be some kind of institutionalized like advisor certification or training, like how to not be a horrible, terrible person to PhD students. Well, grad students in general, but like we're talking about, you know, doctoral programs. Like, I think everybody who has a PhD or is in a PhD program knows a professor at their institution, or even just maybe in their department, who is an advisor and who absolutely should not be an advisor. Like there was somebody in our program at CMU. I won't say who, would actively tell prospective students, don't come here. Like that might be practical advice if you don't think that those students are going to have some kind of viable postgraduate career. But these are students that want to work with you, and all you're saying is no. Like that's you shouldn't be allowed to have graduate students if that's your mentality. Like maybe have that person not be an advisor, and maybe have them work on how to reframe the program. But like there are far too many people out there who should not be advisors, who are advisors and are having grad students. And I think it's a real disservice to the grad students who, you know, again, people always want to criticize the students. It's truly hard for somebody to know what an advisor is going to potentially be like. Like you can always email people who are currently their students. You'll probably get an honest reaction. You might not get any reaction. You might not get an honest reaction. It's hard to say. But like, you just don't know what an advisor is going to be like until you get there. And too often you get there and you realize, wow, this person and I do not get along. I can't really change advisors. Like I can try maybe. So sometimes you get people who are stuck in a situation of stick it out with this terrible advisor or quit the program. And like, those are both really terrible options. So, I mean, there needs to be something done to fix the problems in the advisor-advisee relationship, because I would say that the super majority of the problems in the advisor-advisee relationship are on the advisor's end. I don't know of that many people who were like just terrible students and their advisor was just trying so hard to help them and they just couldn't reach that student. Like, no, it's more often than not the advisor who's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, it's obviously it's a mixed bag depending on who you talk to. Some people have great advisors. some people had real bastards. And it's tough too, because like when you're in your 20s, it's just kind of scary. I mean, you're like scared to kind of, be doing the work to a certain degree. And if you have a scary advisor, you might just be like, well, I guess I'm just gonna plow through this and just get it done. But like, yeah, there's sort of a point of no return. Maybe it's in your mind to a certain degree, but yeah, I think like, switching advisors, that's a big deal. That could set you back. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of factors involved. So
I think there's also a lot of, and this is really part and parcel of the whole problem with grad school in general, at least in my opinion, in my experience, is a lot of advisors had bad advisors. And so they're like, well, I had to deal with it, so you have to deal with it. I mean, it's the same reason why you see these conversations around like how graduate programs should be structured. My program was pretty standard at the time and is pretty standard for how history programs and maybe broadly humanities and social sciences programs always were. It was a 6-year program. First 2 years were coursework, just nothing but coursework. We didn't start TAing until year 2, because they wanted us to have a year of experience just in grad school. I had been a TA before, all 2 years at Cincinnati. I offered to be a TA. They were like, no, don't worry about it. But first 2 years, nothing but coursework. Year 3 was exams and your prospectus. So you studied all summer and all fall, and you took your doctoral exams in like November. That point between Thanksgiving and winter break is I think when I did mine. 3 exams, 3 or 4 hours each, then an oral defense that was like an hour. The typical academic hazing exams, which we can get to that in a minute. Then
that's pretty similar to what I
then prospectus for the second semester of year 3, and then from that point onward you were ABD. From years 4, 5, and 6 were spent researching and writing, and our program gave everybody off 1 semester in year 4 and or some additional summer funding. Like if you really needed to go on like a long trip, like if you were specializing in a country that's like another country, you would get a little bit more funding to be able to go to that country for a while, to go to the archives or whatever. Everybody got some time off in year 4. Year 5 and 6 you were just kind of writing, and then in your final year they give you off 1 semester to just finish up the writing.
That sounds pretty good. Pretty humane. And Carnegie Mellon's a great school, and I guess pretty well funded. But yeah, it just seems like depending on where you go, the structure is always a bit different. Some schools better funded than others.
So I have this interesting relationship with Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon is an elite private school. I won't act like it's not. The history department at Carnegie Mellon is great. I liked my time there. I liked the majority of the professors there. There are a few that I did not care for. They probably know who they are. But the majority of the people in the program were great. I liked them. I liked all of the other grad students. But the history department at Carnegie Mellon, the English department, the philosophy department, the econ, the math department, like the programs at CMU that are not like engineering, robotics, the business school, the performing arts school, like the College of Arts and Sciences is not quite the prestigious institution that the rest of the university is. So like we had good funding in the sense that everybody was funded who was a full-time student there, but it's not like our budget was just, a blank check that we filled in at the end of the year.
Well, I guess you have to talk about also like time with these programs, and it sounds like they did give you some breathing space. Like again, TAing can take up a lot of your time, and if you're doing it right off the bat, it might knock you out in the first year or two because you're just completely swamped. So at least they gave you that 1 year break. Because for me, it was like TAing was your funding, unless you had some kind of fellowship. Like you had to work as a TA or you didn't get funding. So you were like grading tons of exams and whatever, depending on the professor, but like fall, spring, and summer semesters,
it wasn't too bad for us because we all at the beginning of the program TA'd for the same like first year level class.
Okay.
And it wasn't overly burdensome. The class was huge. This class would have 250 people in it, but there'd be like 6 TAs because everybody TA'd for that class, except for a few people who would TA some of the smaller, upper level, like sophomore, second year level classes, maybe.
Yeah.
So like, I never had in total more than like 45 students, 50 students between 2 sections of recitation.
Okay.
But that's also a reflection of the fact that Carnegie Mellon is not that big of a school.
Right.
At the time that I was there, the graduate population, and this is still the case, is bigger than the undergraduate population. The graduate population was like 7,300, something like that. Like, the number doesn't need to be exactly right. It was like 7,300 graduate students, including masters and Ph.D. And then the undergraduate population was like 6,800 or something like that. Like, not a big school. So that's also part of why the teaching situation was the way it was. We didn't have to teach in our first year because there's not that many classes available to teach. Most people at Carnegie Mellon as undergraduates are not there to be arts and sciences majors.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Most of the people at Carnegie Mellon are there for the performing arts, the engineering, the robotics, maybe the public policy or the business schools, but like we did not have that many like dedicated history undergrads at Carnegie Mellon.
Okay.
So, I mean, everybody in the university had to take a history class, so they all invariably took this class. But even then, we didn't need that many people to TA, so it wasn't a big deal for them to give us off that first year. Now, they did it also because they wanted to give us the time to get acclimated, but I suspect that if there was the need for 25 TAs, that they would have had 25 TAs instead of 20 or whatever, because our cohorts were not very big. I was in a cohort of technically 4. 3 of us were full-time, 1 was part-time.
So I want to talk about the job search. Like, were you on the market before your PhD was done? Were you still working on finishing?
I kind of was, because my dissertation was my dissertation was done in like the end of February of last year. Because again, I was, partly because of the pandemic, I had literally nothing else to do. I spent all of 2020 in my apartment working on my dissertation. There was nothing else to do. Where was I going to go?
Right.
So I finished really early. So I was on the market pretty early, and I hadn't graduated yet, but my advisor, I was talking to Joe about this, and I was talking about applying for jobs, and Joe and my other 2 committee members both also said this. When you apply for jobs, feel free to tell them that you are effectively done. Like, however you want to articulate that. Don't say that you have your PhD, because you don't. You haven't graduated yet.
Yeah.
But tell them that like you are effectively done. And if they want to know, whoever this potential employer is, they can get a hold of me, and I'll tell them, yeah, Brad defended his dissertation. He's done. He's just waiting to graduate. There's a 0% chance that Brad is not going to be a PhD come May 23rd or 24th or whatever. So I started applying. I think the first job I applied for was like March of last year.
Okay. So you've been at it almost a year, going on a year and a half.
Over a year. Yeah. I've been at it for like 14 months. So the first thing I applied for was actually a postdoc, not a job.
Okay. And I'm guessing it hasn't changed too much. It's like CV, letters of rec, cover letter for every position, right?
So it depends. I'm mostly applying for things that aren't in academia, because like, there's not that many options in academia, and some of the places that do have tenure track jobs are, frankly, and no offense to people in these places, not places that I want to live. I do not want to live in Texas or Florida or Southern California, because I don't like hot weather that much. Like, I can deal with having like a DC summer, because I know the rest of the year isn't going to be like that. But like, if I live in Florida, I'm going to die. Like, I sunburn too easy. I don't like just being sweaty for no reason at all. Like, I just can't handle it. The politics of any of these places, not even withstanding, not even going to get into that.
Right. Yeah.
I could not survive living in Florida or Texas. Like, I would die. But like, I'm mostly looking at things that are not in academia, maybe like academia adjacent. So like, I've applied to a lot of higher education organizations like the Association of Public and Land Grant Institutions.
Places
that are like think tanks like the Urban Institute or policy and research places. Like that's mostly where I've been looking, because those are places that, and I would recommend this for anybody who's in grad school or who just recently got a PhD. I would look at higher education organizations, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, American Academy of Science, the APLU. I would look at places like that if you're interested, because and places like think tanks or research organizations. Even though I still don't have a job, I've had a lot of interviews at places like those, and they need people with research experience. They need people who are good at working on projects, either independently or as a collaborative effort. And they need people who are good critical thinkers, good analytical minds, and good writers. And if you're sitting there and you're going, well, wait a minute, those are all of the things, literally all of the things that it takes to be a good grad student, you're right. Now, some of these places might not realize that that's what they're looking for, is somebody with a master's or a PhD. They might, you might see a policy job that opens up when they're looking for somebody with like a bachelor's degree in public policy or maybe a master's in public policy. But like, if you really look at the job description and you're sitting there going, well, my PhD in physics would be a perfect match for that because it's a science policy job. Like, who knows what it's like to be a scientist more than a scientist? So I would recommend that people look in places like that, because whether they know it or not, and some of them do, some of them know that they want people with like law degrees and PhDs and Ed.Ds and stuff like that, and master's degrees as well. Apply to those places, because the pay is generally better. There's a lot of opportunity for career advancement, and it comes with its own issues and stresses and whatnot. It's not like working in those places is a cakewalk, but it's definitely not got the problems of academia. That's for sure. And that's one thing that I wish I knew before I started my PhD program. Now, I knew when I started that I was probably not going to get a tenure track job. I went to college. I started my first year at Toledo in 2008 during the economic crisis. And I knew at that point, I was like, I think this might be a problem. And by the time I was in grad school, I knew that there weren't going to be a lot of tenure track jobs opening up, that either people were going to stay in their jobs longer or universities were going to start switching to adjuncts. So even when I started my PhD, I knew I wasn't going to probably be a professor, but I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with the PhD. So yeah, if you're in a PhD program right now, or if you're thinking of going into a PhD program, that's something that I would really suggest people look into. Policy, nonprofit, private research organizations, go on Indeed or LinkedIn and click around a bit, because there's a lot of places out there that you can work that are not universities.
Yeah, I think that's some good advice, because I honestly have not really thought about that, because I do like doing the research and I like writing. Part of it is just sort of, you get boxed in geographically sometimes, if you can't or don't really want to move far away, that can limit you. I haven't necessarily done that. I've tried to keep things open, but depending on where you are, if it's not a big area, you might not be able to get anything nearby. I mean, even within like an hour or two. And with my situation, it's like, well, if it's a job in DC, it might as well be in California. I mean, you can't commute, so you're going to have to move. So there's kind of that hanging over it. But did you throw your hat in the ring with some tenure track jobs maybe earlier on? Did you apply for some?
I did. I applied for a few. I've applied for a few tenure track jobs and a few like really nice postdocs. There are 2 postdocs that I just never heard back from.
Yeah.
No, 3. That's right. There are 3 postdocs I applied to that I never heard back from. There are 2 that rejected me, but it was like 5 months later. So by that point I had forgotten about them. It wasn't a tenure track job, but it was a full-time job, if that distinction makes sense.
Okay.
It was just a teaching job, and I was the finalist. I was a finalist for it. The person who got it is a really good historian. They had been on the job market like 2 years, adjuncting and adjuncting and adjuncting. I have no problem with that person getting the job. They deserved it. They've been on the waiting list longer. Like,
Yeah.
you'd like to think that there's a merit aspect, but also like they've been waiting longer. Like I can't even really be mad that that person got the job. The other academic job I applied for, and this was a mess, and I have a lot of strong opinions on this that I won't share. Well, some of them I will.
You could maybe speak generally, but I remember.
Well, there was one that I applied
yeah.
for, and this might be the one you're thinking of. There's one that I applied for. I forget when I applied for it. I applied shortly before the deadline, like maybe 3 or 4 weeks before the deadline. And then I just never heard back. I got the initial email that said, "Thank you for applying. We'll let you know if you advance to the next stage." And then I just never heard back. And then one day I was on Twitter and I saw somebody who I am friends with on Twitter. And I hold this person really no ill will. They announced that they got the job. And I was like, wow, I haven't even gotten an email back about this. And I actually tweeted about it. I didn't even say who got the job. I didn't say what university it was. All I said was, wow, a job that I applied for just never got back to me. And I found out I didn't get the job because I just saw somebody else get the job. That other person, in point of fact, hadn't even graduated yet. I don't even think they were. Yeah, I mean, they were ABD at the time. Which was frustrating, but Ivy League school.
Right.
And then eventually the hiring manager from that university somehow saw my tweet and sent me an email, personally apologizing for not letting me know. Apparently HR was supposed to handle that and they didn't. And I was like, that's all well and good, but like, if I didn't even make the interview stage, I should have been notified 2 months ago.
Yeah.
So, I mean, academia has a lot of problems, and that I think is a good example of them. Like, no communication whatsoever, and there's data to bear this out. But like the super majority of tenure track jobs in history are going to people from Ivy League schools, and then like the top 10 non-Ivy League programs, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Stanford, what Duke, whatever. So like there's almost no reason to even apply for tenure track job. I mean, there is, but like it's a lot of effort. Anyone who's ever applied for a tenure track job, it's an obscene amount of work that they need. They need like, a research statement, a teaching statement, a personal statement, a diversity and inclusion statement. They want like 3 sample syllabi, letters of recommendation, teaching evaluations. Like it's a portfolio of documents that they need. And it's not like you can just use the same portfolio for every job. Some, they need to be a little bit different. So it's a lot of work, and you might be the best candidate, but you're probably just not going to get the job because they're going to hire the Ivy League person. I mean, the for all of the nice things that I can say about Carnegie Mellon, and again, this is not a slight at the people that were hired, and this is not a slight at people who go to Ivy League schools. If you get in an Ivy League school, go. Of course, go. You're almost guaranteed to get a job. But the last like 6 people that we hired at CMU are Ivy League people. Harvard, Princeton, Penn. You look at smaller departments at schools that are really like teaching level schools. Half of the faculty went to Harvard or Princeton or Yale. Like it's truly not a fair or meritocratic or whatever market right now. So that's why I would encourage people to look at places outside of academia. If you did not go to one of those top 20 programs in whatever your field is, it's probably going to be hard for you to get a tenure track job, especially one at a place that you like. So I mean, it's
well, and everyone is going to be kind of, not to seem rude, but like you're going to be teaching down. Like if you went to usually like, okay, let's say you went to an Ivy, maybe you can teach at Princeton if you went to Princeton or Yale or whatever. But like if you went to a big state school like I did, like you're not going to teach at LSU. You're going to teach at a community college, or you're going to teach at like a 4th tier state school.
I had to explain that to my parents because like, and again, this tier system, in case people aren't aware of, I would never put these universities in a tier system. There is absolutely no value judgment being made on somebody who got a Ph.D. from, the University of Toledo, or, the joke is like, directional state university. Like a Ph.D. is a Ph.D. All right. That's the idea that these schools are inherently better than others. No, those schools are wealthier than others. And they're more powerful and influential. But yeah, there's a tier system. Like if you got a PhD at one of the, if you got a PhD outside of the top 20 universities, your first job is not going to be at one of those top 20 universities. It's going to be at a university that is considered quote unquote lower than yours. You might eventually, if you get like 2 or 3 jobs and keep working your way up, get to that point. But like without pulling up the faculty listing for all 8 Ivy League schools, I would be truly shocked if there was anybody employed full time as a tenured professor at an Ivy League school in the history department that had a PhD from like the University of Toledo or like Western Michigan or like Tennessee State or something. You know what I mean? Like it's just,
it's impossible.
They're all people from the Ivy Leagues or analogous schools. Like, oh, well, we hired somebody from Stanford. It's like, oh, well, congratulations on branching out.
You went to Vanderbilt. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to be,
it's ridiculous.
Scrappy state university in Idaho.
And the state universities that they do employ from, and again, no criticism of these schools, but they're really big, really prestigious, elite state schools. Like you're talking about history here. North Carolina is a fabulous school with a wonderful history department. Michigan, Wisconsin, same thing. Fabulous history departments. Those are the state schools that are probably getting more people hired at places. You know what I mean? Like that's just the reality. Like,
it's always someplace you've heard of, and usually is someplace that everyone has heard of. I mean, they're not gonna get you from an obscure place in the United States. It's just not going to happen. Maybe if you're lucky, you can write your way up a tier. If you got like 3 or 4 books, maybe you can teach at Alabama or Mississippi State or, from like where I'm coming from. It's like, if you went to LSU, you're not going to teach at LSU, but maybe, you could teach at North Carolina State or, one of the a little bit more prominent state schools, but it's not going to be Michigan. It's not going to be UT Austin. So you just got to
if you
deal with that.
If you look at like looking at Ohio, if you look at a lot of the MAC schools, and a lot of the MAC schools are in Ohio, Toledo, Bowling Green, Kent State, Akron, Miami of Ohio, Ohio U, a lot of their faculty are from like big elite schools, but a lot of the faculty who aren't are actually from places like Ohio State, like that next tier up. Like, there were 2 or 3 faculty at Toledo when I was there who had gone to like Ohio State or Michigan State or Minnesota or whatever, like a tier up. But like, I don't think anybody who went to Toledo and got a PhD in the history department, at least it's not on their alumni website. They're not at R1 or R2 universities. They're probably teaching faculty somewhere, or they aren't in academia. And that's again why I say, like, people, I don't like going to the alt-ac phrasing because that makes it sound like, it's either academia or everything else. And there's like a value judgment on if you're not in academia. But I would strongly consider for folks who are on the job market or who are in programs now to start looking at some of those places. And there are regional organizations, but there's national ones too, like the ACLU. ACLU needs people to do research and stuff all the time. And there's an ACLU office in like every major city in the United States.
Yeah.
But like more so than putting it on the students to look that stuff up, I think it's beyond negligent that universities, specifically departments, are not making the all hands on deck effort to change their programs and change their structures. Like Carnegie Mellon's history department, to their credit, got rid of the exams. There's no longer doctoral exams because, like, there's no situation in the real world where I have to be able to recite from memory 150 books. Like, that's bullshit. Right. That's not a real world application. That's not even an application if you're in academia. Name a time that's happened where someone's been like, "Professor, quick!" Like, no, that doesn't happen.
Yeah,
but like universities and departments more broadly, they all want to talk these. They all want to pay this lip service and cry these big crocodile tears about how, our students can't get jobs and we just don't know what to do. It's like, well, figure it out, man. Like, you're all smart people. Like, there's no reason why you can't figure this out. Like, there's no reason why faculty can't reach out to, whether it's local history organizations in their city or research institutions that they know of. Like, it's not like faculty don't know where to begin. Like, faculty have heard of places like the Brookings Institute and the Rand Corporation and the Urban Institute, and they've heard of these private science fund, research institutions. They know where they are. Yeah. There's no reason why universities can't reach out to those places and try and build networks and try and build communities, whether it's to develop things like actual partnerships, like internships or working relationships, or even just go like, hey, here's a good example. I'll use my experience. The Rand Corporation has a location in Pittsburgh. I actually applied for a job there while I was still in Pittsburgh, and I got rejected pretty quickly, which was discouraging. But they have a headquarters just down the street. There's no reason why Carnegie Mellon's history department and maybe even the University of Pittsburgh's history department don't try and meet with some of the folks at Rand and say, hey, maybe you don't have the time or capacity to give us some kind of formal partnership where our students can work with you and build networks. But like, what would you, as a hiring manager at the Rand Corporation, like to see from somebody with a Ph.D. applying for a job at the Rand Corporation? Like, what sort of skills, what sorts of experiences, like what would make them an attractive candidate? And how can we then take those attractive qualities and build them into our Ph.D. program so that we can send students to places like that? And like, I don't see any reason why they couldn't do that. It's not like it would affect a student's ability to get a tenure track job, because you would still have had coursework, you would still have written a dissertation, you would have still taught, you'd still have all of the prerequisite experience that you would need to be a professor. But if you could build in structures that would also give you the experience and skill sets and maybe even just like the marketing terminology to get jobs in other fields, that's helpful to everybody. Departments need to stop looking at the success and failure of their department on how many tenure track professors they make, and just start focusing on how can they help their graduates get employed, because it's a real disservice. And again, I think the majority of the blame needs to go away from the students. It's not the fault of students that they're not getting jobs.
No, I agree with all that. And I think you need to have those discussions. And even like in high school, someone just needs to kind of sit you down and say, what do you really want to do? And then if you're pretty sure, how can we kind of get you there? And in grad school, we're not having those discussions. Some people end up teaching. A lot of them don't. A lot of them don't ever finish the program. But usually universities, there are a lot of different things there that you could sort of try out. So you want to go into publishing? They've got a press or whatever, like the library, the archives, all these other departments that might need people that are from the history department or whatever. And kind of funnel those people in, or just, give them a diversified skill set. But, when I was in, it was like, get your dissertation done and then get a teaching job and then kind of go there. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do, but it was the path I followed. So I had to recalibrate later. And it's been tough, and it's really, it seems like the job market just gets harder by the year. So
it does.
You totally have my sympathies, and I think you got to get going, right?
Yeah. I have a work related call, getting some advice, but, thanks for having me. And, I obviously have not successfully gotten a job yet, but I think I'm closer to getting a job because of all the things that I've learned. So,
good.
Anybody listening to this right now, whether I have a job by the time you hear this or not, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, at Dr. History Brad. I'm more than happy to talk about the things that I've had some measure of success with. And, I'm more than happy to share my non-academic resume and non-academic cover letter style, because it's all different. You can't just take your academic portfolio and ship it to a non-academic job. So if anyone ever wants to reach out for advice, I'm more than happy to give whatever advice I can give.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, Brad. And good luck. I hope you get something soon. And
thank you. You and me both.
I know you'll be tweeting about it, so look forward to hearing some good news. But thanks a lot, and good luck with your call, and I'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It was nice talking today.
All right. That was my talk with Brad Sommer. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, Brad is looking for work. So if you're interested in him and adding him to your team, whatever that may be, doing history. You can contact him on Twitter. His Twitter name is Dr. History Brad, and he tweets quite a bit, so you can find him there quite easily. You can DM him or whatever. Or you can check out his website, bradleyjsommer.com. And he's working on revising his dissertation into a book, so he is staying busy, and his CV is quite impressive, and trying to do something a little different than the traditional historian route of teaching and tenure track. That's kind of the reality. So best of luck to Brad, and hope he lands somewhere soon. This has been American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. I'm the author of Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, in the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. It has been available for a long time now, since 2014. But I have a new book coming out, Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash. That is through University of Arkansas Press, going for about $24.95 paperback and $23.95 or $99 on Kindle. Can't remember exactly, but less than $24, just barely. So if you want the Kindle or you want the paperback version, you can get both for about the same price. That will be released on July 29th. So looking forward to that and seeing how it does. You can also contact me for a signed copy if you wish. I can give you the details of that if you are interested, but shouldn't really cost you any more than a paperback version from Amazon would. If you're interested in a signed copy, please contact me. I am on Twitter as well, Colin E. Woodward. You can DM me. I'm not on Twitter much lately, trying to avoid the horrors of whatever is going on and the self-righteous indignation just for a little while. I don't know. I've scaled back my social media presence. But anyway, I am on Twitter, so you can check me out, or just get it directly from Amazon. You will get the free shipping option, and you should get it pretty soon. So check it out. Country Boy, available July 29th. All right, well, I have taken forever to get this podcast done, so I'm going to stop right here. I will be talking with you later. Take care. Bye.